I'm Christina Rebuffet-Broadus, and welcome to the podcast Crossing the Atlantic, accelerating revenue across the Atlantic for American and European businesses. Last week, if you heard the first episode, we talked about the familiarity trap, how our brains trick us into seeing similarity where only difference exists, how we look at Europe, we as Americans, and we think, well, it's probably a lot like home, but with, different accents and better architecture and better food. Now, this week, I want to show you what that trap actually costs. Because knowing the trap exists is one thing. Understanding the price of walking into it, that is what changes behavior. So let me start with a story. And this one's personal because it's a company that I worked with directly. Now, I'm not going to mention them by name, because the goal is not to name and shame. It's to use this experience as a concrete example of, what this familiarity, it's not an easy word to say, the familiarity trap can cost. So this was a French energy company. They're based somewhere in the northern half of France. Let's just keep it a little vague. And they had been expanding into the US for about 3 or 4 years when they called me. And, here's the thing. Their business was growing, like it was growing fast as well in the US. Revenue was up. They had American clients. They had built up a binational team. They had French employees in different places in France. They had American employees in the US. And of course, they had sent a few of their French people over stateside, to open up the sites and get everything going. So on paper, this was like a classic success story. And it is a success story. But of course, not all success stories are only filled with successes. There was, it's not just black and white. Now, they didn't call me because everything was looking like it was going well. They called me because on the inside, the team was, I'm not going to say it was falling apart. That would be maybe a little harsh, but definitely tensions had been building up for months. So we had the French team in France who felt like the Americans were making decisions without consulting them. The American team felt like Paris kept slowing everything down with their processes and their approvals and their months of meetings and going back and forth. And some of the French expats who had been sent over to the US were struggling with, you know, I'm going to say something that nobody had really prepared them for. And it wasn't the work aspects necessarily, but it was kind of everything that went around it. There were some work aspects, of course, but it wasn't just that. They were shocked by how much of daily life in America costs money. Things like healthcare, childcare, access to national parks, things that are free or, covered by taxes are covered by the government in France. Suddenly all of this was an out-of-pocket expense. And, it wasn't just in their personal life that they were having difficulties adapting. This was also, affecting their work and their relationships with their colleagues because, I'm going to say that when it comes to the work aspect and how they were building up their business, they had built their entire European sales message around the ecological impact of their product. And because that's what resonated in France. France is pushing very hard for green initiatives and sustainability. And Europe in general is just much more in tune and much more sensitive to this thing. An example is like when I take the train here in France, there's a message that said, you have saved X tons of carbon by choosing the train instead of your car. I was going to say your voiture. That's French. That message, that ecological message, it really resonated. And they built up their business very successfully around that in France and in Europe. But American buyers kept asking them, the same questions, that were not the same questions of their French, buyers, but the same questions kept coming up from their American buyers. What's the return on investment? How does this affect my bottom line? What is this going to cost? What is this going to bring me? And they really had to switch over their message to talk about the money rather than the ecological aspects, which was kind of the nice to have. And the French team at first, they didn't know how to have that conversation because it felt like by focusing so much on the money, the return on investment, the profits, that they were kind of like almost betraying their original mission. And one of the things that happened was just nobody had done, I don't think, any intercultural preparation when the expansion started. I mean, why would they? Business was growing. Revenue was coming in. They were hiring people. Everything looked fine until it wasn't. And this story isn't unusual. I mean, I've watched this pattern repeat itself over numerous companies that I've worked with. The details change, the industry changes, but the structure is generally the same. A company crosses the Atlantic, the numbers look good, and everybody assumes that the cultural stuff will just sort itself out. But it doesn't. And it's consistent enough that we can actually put numbers on this. So here's the data point that, I'm not going to be cliche and say it keeps me up at night. No, I sleep fine, but I find that it is just a real, pity that 68% of failed transatlantic expansions trace back to cultural assumptions that are made in the first 90 days. We're not talking about product market fit issues. We're not talking about capital constraints. It's not bad timing. We're talking about cultural blind spots. These are moments when leaders believed their instincts over actual market research. It's moments when they assumed instead of stepping back, taking the time to observe and to learn. And I'm going to say this again because it's important. 68% of failures come from assumptions, not from circumstances. And here's the related point that most companies don't realize. 70% of companies that underperform in their first year internationally made their biggest strategic bets before they spent 90 days in genuine observation. Let me be specific about what I mean by genuine observation. I don't mean visiting your new office. I don't mean having some lunches with your team. I mean 90 days of actual market listening, customer interviews, competitive analysis, hiring conversations, pricing tests, decision maker mapping, sitting in sales calls and watching where the friction points actually are, not where you imagine that they might be. Now, a lot of times when I talk to French companies who are expanding into the US, and I mentioned that we do this. We do market validation. We do all of this research. And they say, yeah, I don't want research. I don't want another consulting report. I already got one of those from somebody else and it didn't really tell me anything. Or, I don't want to waste time on, the market study aspect or going in and just studying and getting some facts that I can find on ChatGPT or Claude. That is a big mistake because there's a big difference between, generating something with artificial intelligence and generating something with artificial intelligence, but also going and comparing it to data, comparing it to experience, calling up people, asking questions, and enriching what you're going to find through an artificial intelligence with real world intelligence, let's say. Now, the companies in the top 30%, the ones who actually performed well in year one, they do something different and they do take the time and the energy and the resources to invest in this first phase of studying, observation, and understanding and adapting. They treat the first quarter like a research phase, not an execution phase. And I know that sounds slow. I know it sounds like you're not making progress because we all want to get out there and we all want to start calling up clients and trying to sell our stuff and say, you know what, we'll learn as we go. But what I've seen is that these companies who treat their first quarter like a research phase, they spent less money in years 1 and 2 than the companies who tried to move fast. And by year 3, they had earned it back 3 times over. So why do these assumptions survive even smart people's due diligence? It's because they're not usually obviously wrong. And that's the trap. Let me give you a real example from a SaaS company I worked with. It's an American company, good product, selling to enterprises. And in their home market back in the US, enterprise decision making generally moves fast in the sector that they're in. So a VP can see a tool that solves her problem and greenlight it. She has that kind of budget authority. She doesn't need a whole lot of consensus. She doesn't need the CTO's blessing necessarily unless she's got some specific questions. She's got this autonomy and she uses it. Now, I know this is not the case in every company, but this is one example. And this founder assumed that that was how business worked. Period. Different country, same rules. So he came to France. He started building up his sales process on that assumption. One decision maker, move fast, quick buying cycles. Except, and you probably see where this is going, that's not how it works in France. Enterprise buying there, it's formal. I mean, I know I've had a business here in France since 2017, and we were going into companies. I was going into companies and selling contracts, almost up near the six-figure range. It takes time. It takes conversations with different people. Legal has a seat at the table sometimes. You've got IT infrastructure sometimes that matter. There are security protocols that matter. A feature that's maybe a nice to have in the US could become a must have in France or vice versa. And not knowing that can sometimes disqualify your deal. And the buying cycle that maybe takes, 3 to 6 months in the US can take, like 3 times that in France. I've had the longest buying cycle I think I had was something like 18 months or 24 months. It was super long. And, going back to the founder here, he didn't discover this in month 1. He discovered it in month 3 when his pipeline hadn't moved. And by then, he'd already committed to a sales approach. He'd already hired salespeople trained in the American model. He'd already sized up his burn rate based on the wrong assumptions and how long a deal would take. Now, neither approach is better in and of itself. That's kind of the beauty of cultural differences. There's no one way that is inherently better. The American model isn't smarter and the European model isn't more sophisticated. They're just different. But if you build your entire strategy around one and then try to apply it to the other, you're going to lose deals. You're going to lose time and you're going to lose money. What I've started calling this is a problem of operating systems. And I want to introduce this framework because I think it helps people to see the problem more clearly than this abstract idea of cultural differences, especially if you're looking at the surface and you're saying, Western cultures, we have a lot of the same references. We both use English to communicate. Where are the differences here? Now, I want you to think about your computer for a second. If you're on a Mac, you're running Mac OS. If you're on Windows, you're running Windows. It's different operating systems entirely, right? Different architecture, different file structures, different how things get done under the hood. Now, whether you're a Mac or a Windows person, that's your own business. I'm not judging anybody. But what happens if you try to run Windows software on a Mac? Doesn't work. You get an error. You need some kind of translator, let's say, some kind of middleware that lets one system talk to the other. And business culture works exactly the same way. Your home market runs on one operating system. This set of invisible rules about how business gets done, how decisions are made, who has authority, what builds trust, how risk is evaluated, what communication style works, what pace feels normal. And when you expand to a new country, if you're running your American operating system on European infrastructure or vice versa, you can't do it without going through some kind of middleware, let's say. The American operating system, very broadly speaking, prioritizes speed and individual accountability. Get it right at 70% and learn fast, move quickly, decide decisively, take calculated risks, communications direct, sometimes maybe a little too direct, feedback, And relationships are important, but results are what matter. The European operating system, again, and I'm generalizing here across France, Germany, UK, every country is very different. And like I always say, depending on what country you're working in, you are going to want to really focus on the specific differences for that country. But generally speaking, here in Europe, we're going to prioritize depth and consensus. Get it right 90% of the time before you move. Slow down for the relationships. Build up the formal structures. Protect against risk first. There's a lot of aversion to risk. Communication is contextual. Feedback might be more nuanced. Relationships have a lot of importance, and it's not just in how you work together, but in how decisions are made, how risks are evaluated, and how authority flows. Now, these systems are almost inverted on some dimensions. They're incompatible if you don't do the quote unquote translation work. What I've seen when companies don't do that work, the American team feels like everything moves at a snail's pace. No pun intended there. Snails are good. If you've never eaten them, try them out. Anyway, American team is going to feel like things are moving very slowly. The European team feels like they're constantly being overridden. Nobody's listening to them. The Americans are making decisions and taking action too fast, and then everything messes up and they have to go back and redo it, and it's a waste of time. Your best local hires will burn out because they're caught between two systems that are pulling them in opposite directions. I have seen this. And, I worked with a company last year where the founder, an American based in Silicon Valley, was frustrated that his German team wasn't moving faster. Why do we need to talk legal before we even have a customer? Why do we have to spend this time? The thing that we need to do is get out there, start selling, and then we can figure it out as we go. The German team was frustrated because he wanted to ship something that legal had concerns about. And their system, that's not, caution. It's negligence. And neither one was wrong. They were just operating on different systems, and nobody had done that quote unquote translation work in order to bridge the two systems. When I talk about translation, I'm not talking about language. I'm talking about the way of working together. So I want to tell you a story about a company that got this right. And I'm going to use this as a concrete example because getting it right actually looks pretty specific. This one was a fintech company, again, American, venture-backed, done very well at home, wanted to expand into Europe, starting with France, and they had a good product and a good solid team. Instead of what most companies do, which is just kind of drop their full US playbook into Europe and hope for the best, they did something smarter. They hired one person, one local advisor, someone who had spent 20 years in French banking, not to manage their sales team, not to run the office, just to sit in on customer calls and do that translation work. And by that, I mean interpreting what they were hearing, what was the intention behind it, what was the message that wasn't being said. And for 6 weeks, this advisor was in every customer conversation. He wasn't there to close deals. He was there to clarify, to decode, to point out where American assumptions were creating friction that the team couldn't see. To explain the European context, why this feature mattered more than they thought, why that legal concern was actually a red flag in France, even if it wasn't in the US. And what happened was within 3 months, they had completely rewritten their sales process. And it's not that it was broken or that it was bad. It was just because they had taken the time to do that adaptation work. They changed their pricing model because the market would actually bear different price points if you understood how value gets perceived differently. And they had reframed their entire value prop because they understood what actually mattered to their European customers, to their French customers, and it was very different from what mattered to their American customers. And it might sound like it was a complete overhaul, but it wasn't a complete overhaul. The product itself didn't really require any changes. The core product didn't change. It was the mission, the mission didn't change, but it was the way that they went to market, the way they positioned it, the way they sold. All of that needed to change. And because they did it, in month 2 instead of in month 12, they didn't have to restart. They didn't burn through a lot of extra cash trying to figure this out as they go. They weren't trying to get out there and sell and try to figure out and adjust and, just create a nightmare for their sales team. And they didn't demoralize their local team. They had one person, 90 days, and a willingness to observe before they committed. And that investment paid for itself by month 8. So if you're sitting with me right now and you're thinking about expanding across the Atlantic, here's the framework I would suggest. It's 3 phases, and it's simpler than it sounds. Phase 1, observe. And this is the one that most companies try to skip because it feels like lost time. And like I said, we're all in a hurry to get out there and start selling and start bringing in that revenue. You spend the first 90 days in deliberate listening, not selling, listening. You're going to talk to 30, 40, 50 potential customers, and the goal is not to close them, although you might close them later. The goal here is just to understand their world. What does their buying process look like? Not what do you think it looks like? What does it actually look like? Who holds the real decision power? And I mean the real power, not the person with the title. What are their top 3 concerns? How do they define value? And does that differ from your home market? What assumptions are baked into their industry that you're not aware of? What's the role of relationships in business? And how deep do they need to be before someone will talk to you? And what's the role of any kind of formal processes? And you also talk to people, who've tried to serve this market and failed. They're some of your most honest feedback right there. They're not trying to sell you anything. They're just telling you the truth about where they hit the wall. And you talk to your local team, your advisors, your potential hires, people who actually live inside this operating system. And you ask them where they see the biggest gap between what you're planning and what's actually going to work. Phase 2 is translate. And I don't mean just translate the language. Now, once you've listened, and this is important, you don't rebuild everything from scratch, usually. But this is a mistake that I see companies make. They gather data and then they throw out their entire playbook. But instead, you identify where your business model needs to flex a little bit. Where does your sales process need to slow down? Where do you need formal structure where you had agility before? What does your team need to learn? Where will you hire differently? And most importantly, what stays the same because it's core to your DNA, it's core to who you are, and what needs to be adapted in the new market. Some companies are speed obsessed for a reason. That's their competitive advantage. But maybe they execute it differently in Europe. Maybe they get speed in a different dimension, in decision-making quality, customer support, product iteration, rather than in sales cycle length. So this translation is not about becoming European or, totally reinventing, usually in any case. It's just about being smart about where your way works and where it needs to be adapted. And phase 3 is the pilot. You don't do a full launch. You run a controlled test in one market where you can experiment, fail, learn, and adjust before you commit serious capital. And then I'm going to say this is something that a lot of companies don't do. Once you've piloted and you learn, you go back to phase 1 for different regions. Because like I said, France and Germany are definitely not the same. I think a lot of Americans, we look at Europe as kind of like a block. They're totally different. The fact that they have different languages, the cultures are equally as different. UK is not the same as France. And if you try to tell any French person they will probably give you death stare. So if you're expanding to 4 countries, you don't do a piloted approach in France and then assume it works in Germany. You see the pattern, right? Observe, translate, pilot, repeat. Now, I know you're probably thinking, oh, good God, Christina, this sounds so slow. Sounds like I'm losing a ton of time while my competitors are moving fast. But the data says this. Companies that skip this stage and try to move fast make their biggest strategic bets before they've done the research. 70% of those companies underperform in year one. So the companies that slow down for 90 days actually spend less money in years 1 and 2. They make better hires because they understand what they're actually looking for, and they avoid the big mistakes that would force a restart in year 2 or year 3. Now, there is a cost to moving fast without observing. And in the case of international expansion, that cost is usually hidden until month 7 or 8 when you realize you need to completely rethink your approach. And the companies that are, again, back in that top 30%, they realize this and they pay that price up front. They take that 90 days of listening, understanding, translating, validating, identifying all of that, qualifying, and then they make their move. And that patience always pays off. Now, I want to be clear about something. Understanding that you have operating systems that don't match. Understanding that there's a kind of a lost in translation problem, but again, not just language. That's phase 1. That's crossing the Atlantic this week. But knowing the problem exists isn't the same as knowing how to move through it when you're in the middle of your own expansion. And that's where I'm going to take you next. How do you actually price in Europe? How does that conversation change? How do you hire? What are you actually looking for in your first local team? How do you structure your team so that the best people from both sides can actually work together without driving each other crazy? These are going to be the real tactical questions, and they all come back to operating systems. They come back to understanding that you're not running one system anymore. You're running layers of translation and adaptation, and those layers need to be intentional. So here's what I want to leave you with. Last week, we talked about how our brains lie to us, how familiarity creates blind spots, and how we see similarity where in reality, differences exist. This week, I've shown you what that cost. 68% of failure, 70% of underperformers, real money, real time, real opportunity cost. But I've also shown you that it doesn't have to be that way. One company hired one advisor, spent 90 days listening, doing the translation, the adaptation work, and avoided the restart that would have cost them everything. So the invitation here is simple. And this is something that we Americans have a hard time doing. Slow down. Observe. Adapt and translate. It feels like lost time until you see it from the other side, when you realize that you've actually saved 6 months and a quarter of your budget because you didn't have to redo what you'd already done wrong. And that's the return on the investment of slowing down. So if you're building across the Atlantic, whether you're American and expanding into Europe or European and coming into the US, I would love to hear from you. The stories and scenarios that I work with every day are what feeds this series. So if you've experienced this, you've made these assumptions and lived through the cost, or if you're about to make a jump and you want to avoid the trap, don't be a stranger. Go ahead and reach out and let's talk. You can find all the links in the show notes, including a way to book a conversation with me directly. And next week, we're going to go deeper. We're going to talk about hiring, about pricing, about how to actually structure your team so that you're not just surviving the operating system mismatch, you're thriving because of it. Thanks for listening. This has been Crossing the Atlantic, and I'll talk to you next time.